Everyone thought the billionaire's son was dumb. He failed every math test, no matter how many tutors his father hired. But then, one day, a maid walked into the mansion. And with nothing but cookies, toys, and kindness, she changed his life forever. What happened next will leave you speechless. Failed again. The furious roar of billionaire Richard Hamilton shook the walls of his enormous marble mansion. His voice carried through the grand dining hall, bouncing off crystal chandeliers and polished oak panels. On the long dining table lay a crumpled math test paper, covered in red crosses and stamped with a giant merciless F. Across from him, 10-year-old Daniel Hamilton sat frozen in his chair, his shoulders hunched as if he could shrink away from a storm. His little hands trembled on his lap, and his eyes, wide and wet, stared down at the floor. He wasn't dumb. He wasn't lazy. But to Daniel, numbers were like enemies, twisting, slipping, and laughing at him whenever he tried to solve them. While other children filled their pages with answers, he stared at empty spaces, his chest tightening with panic. Richard slammed his fist against the polished mahogany table, the silverware rattling. His face, usually calm and composed in business meetings, was now red with fury. "You're my son, my heir, and you can't even pass a simple math test? How will you ever take over my empire one day?" The word empire hung in the air. Richard wasn't exaggerating. He was one of the wealthiest men in the country, owner of real estate towers, luxury hotels, and international corporations. His life was built on success, discipline, and perfection. In his world, there was no room for failure. Daniel's lips quivered, and his voice cracked like fragile glass. "I'm sorry, Dad. I tried." Tried. That word made Richard's jaw tighten. To him, trying without results was the same as not trying at all. He turned away, unable to look at the boy who carried his name, but not, in his eyes, his strength. For Richard, failure was unacceptable. And tonight, his son had failed again. Silence filled the massive dining hall. Only the ticking of the golden clock on the wall could be heard. Daniel sat still, afraid to move, afraid to breathe too loudly. When Richard finally rose and left the room, the boy's small body sagged with relief, but the ache in his chest only grew heavier. That night, in the enormous Hamilton mansion with dozens of rooms, Daniel curled up alone in his bed. The mattress was soft, the sheets expensive, the nightlight shaped like a glowing star, but none of it brought him comfort. He clutched his pillow tightly, pressing his face against it to hide his tears. The world outside thought he was lucky. Who wouldn't want to be the son of a billionaire? To live surrounded by wealth? To have everything money could buy? But what no one saw was the weight that came with it. At school, his classmates teased him. "You're rich, why are you so dumb at math?" they'd whisper, snickering behind his back. His teachers sighed when they handed him yet another failed test, shaking their heads with pity. Even the tutors his father hired, strict, serious men in suits, ended up frustrated, telling Richard his son just didn't try hard enough. But Daniel did try. He stayed up late staring at numbers until they blurred together. He bit his lip until it bled, gripping his pencil so tightly his hand hurt. Yet no matter what, the answers always seemed wrong. And each red cross on his paper was like a knife cutting deeper into his small heart. Now, lying awake in the dark, Daniel whispered to himself, "Why can't I just be smart? Why can't I be what Dad wants me to be?" The mansion was quiet, but inside Daniel's mind, voices echoed. "You'll never be good enough. You'll always fail. Your father will never be proud of you." He pulled the blanket over his head as if it could block out the thoughts, but the truth was impossible to hide from. At just 10 years old, Daniel felt completely alone. The truth was, Daniel didn't just fear math. He feared disappointing. Every failure wasn't just a bad grade. It was proof to him that he was broken. And worst of all, his father, the man he admired, the man whose approval he craved, had already given up on him. The next morning at breakfast, the long dining table was covered with plates of fresh fruit, eggs, and golden brown pancakes prepared by the staff. But Daniel barely touched his food. He pushed pieces of strawberry around his plate with his fork, his eyes heavy with exhaustion from the night before. Richard sat across from him, reading the newspaper, his face hidden behind the tall sheets. He didn't say a word about the test. He didn't say a word at all. That silence hurt Daniel more than the yelling had. "Eat," Richard muttered finally, without looking up. Daniel obeyed quietly, swallowing bites he couldn't taste. Inside, his stomach was twisted in knots. When breakfast was over, Richard folded his newspaper and stood. "Your tutor will be here at 4. Don't waste his time." Daniel nodded, but inside he felt the same sinking dread he always did. Another tutor, another session, another evening of numbers that refused to make sense. As his father left for work, Daniel whispered under his breath, "I'll fail again. I always fail." And though the mansion glittered with wealth, in Daniel's small world, everything felt cold and empty. He didn't know it yet, but change was coming. Someone unexpected was about to walk into his life. Someone who would see the boy behind the mistakes. Someone who would believe in him when no one else did. But for now, all Daniel could feel was the crushing weight of his father's disappointment and the fear that he would never, ever be good enough. The next morning, the Hamilton mansion welcomed a new face. Her name was Clara Johnson, a soft-spoken black woman in her late 30s. She carried a small suitcase in one hand and a notebook tucked under her arm. Though she wore a simple maid's uniform, there was something about her that stood out. She had kind eyes, a warm smile, and carried herself with quiet dignity. She had been hired as the new maid, replacing yet another worker who couldn't handle Richard Hamilton's strict rules. Everyone in the city knew the billionaire was a difficult man to please. Most staff didn't last longer than a few weeks. Clara, however, seemed unfazed. The mansion's other employees whispered as she walked in. "Poor thing," one said. "She doesn't know what she's getting into." "Another one gone in a month," another muttered. But Clara ignored the whispers. She had worked hard all her life, raising 3 younger siblings after her mother passed away, holding down multiple jobs to survive. She had faced challenges much harsher than a wealthy man's temper. And more importantly, she carried a heart full of patience. That morning, as she walked past the dining hall, she noticed a boy sitting silently at the long table. His plate was untouched, his shoulders hunched. His big eyes looked tired, as though the weight of the world already rested on them. Clara's lips curved into a gentle smile. "Good morning, young man. I'm Clara. You must be Daniel." Daniel looked up, startled. Most staff didn't speak to him unless it was about schedules or homework. And when they did, their tone carried pity or annoyance. But Clara's voice was different. It was warm, soft, almost like a hug. Still, Daniel didn't know how to respond. He simply nodded shyly, muttered a quick hi, and ran off before she could say more. Clara watched him go, her smile fading into concern. She could already sense something heavy inside that boy. Something no amount of wealth could cover up. A week passed, and Clara began to notice patterns in the Hamilton household. Richard left early in the morning, his shoes clicking sharply across the marble floors, his face set in stone. He returned late at night, tired but still stern, with barely a word for his son. Daniel, meanwhile, spent most of his time alone. Tutors came and went, but none seemed to reach him. The boy avoided eye contact, rarely spoke more than a few words, and carried a sadness far too big for his small frame. Clara's suspicions deepened one evening when she overheard shouting. "Failed again." Richard's booming voice echoed through the halls. "I spend thousands on tutors, and this is the result." Daniel's small voice cracked. I tried, Dad." "Don't say tried. Winners don't try, Daniel. They do." Clara's heart squeezed. She set down the tray she was carrying and stepped back before she was noticed. A moment later, she saw Daniel rush past her, tears streaming down his cheeks, clutching a crumpled math test in his fist. She didn't hesitate. Quietly, she followed him out into the garden. The Hamilton garden was massive, filled with roses, trimmed hedges, and fountains. But Daniel didn't notice its beauty. He ducked behind a tree, sat on the grass, and buried his face in his hands. His small shoulders shook with sobs. Clara approached slowly, careful not to startle him. She sat beside him, leaving a little space so he didn't feel trapped. For a moment, she said nothing, just waited. Finally, in a soft voice, she asked, "Do you hate math, Daniel?" The boy sniffled, wiping his nose with his sleeve. His eyes were red, his cheeks streaked with tears. "It hates me first," he muttered bitterly. "No matter what I do, I always fail. Dad says I'm useless." Clara's chest tightened at his words. She had heard children call themselves many things, but useless was the most painful of all. She turned to him, her eyes full of compassion. "Daniel, you are not useless. Do you hear me? You just need to learn in a way that makes sense to you." Daniel blinked, confused. No one had ever said that to him before. Tutors always called him lazy, careless, or distracted. His father called him weak. But Clara's words were different. "You don't think I'm dumb?" he asked quietly, almost afraid of the answer. Clara smiled gently. "Not at all. Everyone learns differently. Some people learn by reading, some by listening, and some by doing. You just need the right way, the way that works for you." Daniel's lips trembled. A part of him wanted to believe her, but another part whispered that it couldn't be true. "But I failed so many times." Clara placed a hand lightly over his. "Failure isn't the end, Daniel. It's just proof that you're trying. Every mistake is a step toward learning. You only truly fail if you give up." Her words wrapped around him like a blanket. For the first time, Daniel didn't feel judged. He felt understood. They sat together in the garden as the sun began to set, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink. Daniel slowly stopped crying. His breathing calmed. His shoulders relaxed. Clara didn't push him to talk more. She just stayed beside him, steady and patient. Before heading inside, Daniel glanced at her. His voice was soft but sincere. "Thank you for not being mad at me." Clara squeezed his hand gently. "There's nothing to be mad about, Daniel. You're not a problem to fix. You're a boy to be believed in." As they walked back toward the mansion, Daniel felt something new stirring inside him. It wasn't confidence, not yet, but it was the faintest spark of hope. And for Clara, that tiny spark was enough. She knew that with time, patience, and kindness, that spark could grow into a flame bright enough to change everything. She didn't know exactly how yet, but she silently promised herself one thing: Daniel Hamilton would never feel useless again. That evening, as the mansion grew quiet and the last rays of sun faded behind the tall windows, Clara gathered her courage and approached Richard Hamilton in his office. The billionaire sat behind his massive oak desk, scanning financial reports with sharp eyes. When Clara stepped inside, he barely looked up. "Yes," he said flatly. Clara clasped her hands together. "Mr. Hamilton, I'd like to spend some extra time with Daniel after I finish my chores." Richard raised an eyebrow. "Extra time? What for?" Clara hesitated. She knew Richard didn't tolerate wasted effort. "I think I can help him with his studies. Maybe in a different way." Richard leaned back in his chair, his expression skeptical. "I've hired the best tutors money can buy. All of them failed. What makes you think a maid can succeed where they couldn't?" Clara didn't flinch. She spoke with quiet conviction. "Because I don't see Daniel as a problem to fix. I see a boy who needs someone to believe in him." For the first time, Richard looked directly at her, his eyes narrowing. But instead of dismissing her, he sighed and waved a hand. "Fine. Do what you want. Just don't expect miracles." Clara nodded with a small smile. She didn't need miracles. She just needed patience. The very next afternoon, Clara appeared in Daniel's room with a tray of fresh cookies. The sweet smell drifted through the air, and Daniel's eyes immediately lit up. "Cookies?" he asked, surprised. "Cookies," he asked, surprised. Clara nodded. She set the tray on the table between them. "Yes, but these aren't just cookies, they're math cookies." Daniel tilted his head in confusion. "Math cookies." Clara grinned. "Exactly. Look, Daniel. Here are 12 cookies. Now, if we eat 3, how many are left?" Daniel hesitated, his mind racing. Numbers usually made his chest tighten, but somehow, looking at the cookies felt different. He counted carefully. 9. Clara clapped her hands. "Yes. Perfect. You see? Math isn't scary. It's just counting things we can touch." Daniel blinked in surprise. For the first time, math actually made sense. The next day, Clara came prepared with a basket of apples. She placed them on the table. If you have 6 apples and you give 2 to your friend, how many do you have left? Daniel picked up the apples, moving them with his hands. 4. Clara nodded proudly. Exactly. Math is just a story. And you, Daniel, are the hero solving it. He smiled, an honest smile, not the forced ones he wore for his father. Day after day, Clara turned numbers into games. Some days she used Lego blocks to build towers, asking him to add or subtract bricks. Other days, she lined up his toy cars, creating little traffic jams that Daniel had to solve with multiplication or division. But Clara didn't stop there. She wove math into stories. Once upon a time, she began one afternoon. There was a little knight who needed to cross a bridge. The bridge had 5 planks, but 2 were broken. How many safe planks were left for him to walk on? Daniel's imagination sparked. He could picture the knight, the bridge, the danger. 3, he answered eagerly. Clara's eyes twinkled. Correct. And the knight crossed safely because you solved the problem. Daniel laughed, clapping his hands. For the first time, math wasn't an enemy. It was an adventure. But Clara wasn't just teaching him equations. She was teaching him confidence. Whenever Daniel got an answer wrong, his face would fall, fear flashing in his eyes, as if he expected her to yell like his father. But Clara never raised her voice. Instead, she would smile gently and say, "That's okay, Daniel. Let's try again. Mistakes are proof you're learning." At first, Daniel didn't believe her. Mistakes had always meant punishment, shame, or disappointment. But the more Clara repeated it, the more his fear loosened its grip. Slowly, he began to see errors not as proof of failure, but as stepping stones. And something remarkable happened. Daniel began to laugh during lessons. His eyes, once clouded with dread, now sparkled with curiosity. One evening he even said, "Clara, can we do more math today?" She smiled, her heart swelling. "Of course, Daniel. As much as you like." Meanwhile, Richard started to notice changes too, though he didn't understand them. He would walk past Daniel's study and pause, surprised to hear laughter echoing from the room. He peeked in once and saw his son grinning, surrounded by cookies and toy cars, eagerly solving problems with Clara. The billionaire frowned, confused. How is she succeeding where experts failed? He wondered. But instead of interrupting, he silently walked away, unwilling to admit, yet, that the maid might be doing something extraordinary. As weeks passed, Daniel's fear of numbers began to fade. He sat taller, spoke louder, and even started helping Clara measure ingredients in the kitchen, proudly announcing the fractions. 1 cup plus 1/2 cup is 1½ cups, he exclaimed one afternoon while baking. Clara clapped. Exactly. Look at you, Daniel. You're becoming a math whiz. Daniel giggled, his cheeks glowing with pride. It wasn't just about numbers anymore. Daniel was changing. He was learning to trust himself, to believe that he wasn't broken. And every smile he wore was proof that Clara's patience and love were healing wounds that wealth and tutors never could. For the first time in his life, Daniel looked forward to learning. And for Clara, that was the greatest victory of all. Weeks later, another math test arrived. Daniel sat at his desk in class, his pencil trembling slightly in his hand. The paper in front of him seemed to stare back, full of numbers and problems waiting to trip him up. Normally, this was the moment fear crushed him. His stomach would twist, his palms would sweat, and his mind would go blank. But this time, Clara's voice echoed in his memory. "You're not dumb, Daniel. You're capable. Just breathe. Take one step at a time." He closed his eyes, inhaled deeply, and whispered to himself, "I can do this." With that, he picked up his pencil and began. At first, his hand shook as he wrote the first answer. But as he worked through the problems, he remembered Clara's lessons, the cookies, the cars, the stories of knights crossing bridges. He could see the numbers in his mind, not as scary symbols, but as objects he could touch, count, and move around. The fear didn't vanish completely, but for the first time, it didn't control him. When the test ended, Daniel's heart pounded. He bit his lip, staring at the paper as the teacher collected it. Doubt whispered in his mind. What if you failed again? What if Dad was right all along? But another voice, Clara's, whispered louder. Mistakes are proof you're learning. For once, Daniel dared to hope. The next day, the teacher handed back the results. Papers shuffled across the classroom, students whispering and comparing grades. Daniel's hands shook as his paper slid onto his desk, face down. He stared at it, afraid to flip it over. Finally, with a shaky breath, he turned it. B+. Daniel's eyes widened. For a second, he thought he was imagining it. A B+. It wasn't perfect, but it was the highest grade he had ever gotten in math. Higher than he had ever dreamed possible. His throat tightened, tears springing to his eyes, not from sadness, but from joy. He wanted to shout, to laugh, to run. And that's exactly what he did. As soon as the final bell rang, Daniel bolted out of the classroom, clutching the paper tightly in his hands. He ran through the school gates, down the street, and all the way home, his heart racing with excitement. When he reached the mansion, he burst through the grand doors, his voice echoing against the marble walls. Dad, look, I passed. Richard Hamilton, who had just returned from a business meeting, looked up in surprise. His son's face was glowing, flushed with excitement, holding a paper like it was a trophy. Richard frowned, skeptical. He snatched the test from Daniel's hands and looked at it. His eyes narrowed at first, scanning the grade carefully. Then, slowly, something shifted. His usual anger melted into shock. And beneath that shock, something even rarer was pride. For the first time in years, Richard saw hope in his son's eyes. Daniel wasn't defeated. He wasn't broken. He was beaming. How did this happen? Richard muttered, more to himself than to Daniel. Daniel turned and pointed at Clara, who had been standing quietly in the background, holding a laundry basket. She hadn't expected recognition. She was just there, as always, steady, supportive, and unseen. She believed in me, Daniel said proudly, when no one else did. Richard's gaze shifted to Clara. For a moment, their eyes met. And in that silence, Richard felt something unusual, a deep, uncomfortable truth. He had given up on his son. He had seen weakness where Clara had seen potential. Daniel rushed forward and hugged his father tightly. I did it, Dad. Richard, still holding the paper, hesitated before slowly placing a hand on his son's back. His voice was quieter now. Yes, you did. Behind them, Clara smiled softly, her heart full. She didn't need thanks. The look on Daniel's face was enough. This test was more than a grade. It was proof that Daniel could rise. Proof that belief was stronger than pressure. And for the first time, the Hamilton mansion wasn't filled with anger or silence. It was filled with hope. That night, Richard Hamilton sat alone in his grand office. The walls were lined with shelves of books on business, law, and finance. Awards, framed newspaper articles, and photographs of his towering hotels decorated the room. Everything around him was a symbol of power and achievement. And yet, as he stared at the math paper sitting on his desk, the one marked with a proud B+, Richard felt something unusual. Not triumph, not satisfaction, but shame. For years, he had convinced himself that his son's failures reflected weakness. He had believed Daniel was careless, lazy, unworthy of the Hamilton name. But now, holding this paper, he realized the truth. The weakness had been his own. He had failed to see his son. With a heavy sigh, Richard pressed the intercom. Send Clara to my office. Moments later, Clara entered quietly, her hands folded in front of her. She looked calm, but her eyes were steady, unafraid. Richard leaned back in his chair, studying her. Finally, he spoke. I hired you as a maid, he said slowly, his voice quieter than usual. But you've done more for my son than the most expensive tutors in this city. Tell me, how? Clara met his gaze with quiet strength. Children don't need perfection, Mr. Hamilton, she said. They need patience, love, and someone who believes in them. Daniel was never failing math. He was failing to be understood. Her words struck him like a blow. Richard had spent his life chasing perfection. In his world, numbers were absolute, results were everything, and mistakes meant weakness. But Clara was right. He had demanded perfection from a child who had only ever wanted his father's love. For the first time in years, Richard felt ashamed, not of his son, but of himself. He turned away, staring out the tall glass windows at the glittering city below. "I've been so focused on success," he murmured, "that I forgot what really matters." Clara didn't lecture him further. She simply gave a small nod and left the room, trusting that her words would sink in. The next morning, the Hamilton mansion was unusually quiet. Daniel sat at the long breakfast table, poking at his pancakes. Normally, his father would rush through a quick meal, buried in his newspaper, offering nothing but criticism or silence. But today, Richard did something no one expected. He folded his newspaper and set it aside. Then he pulled out the chair beside his son and sat down, not across from him like a distant figure of authority, but right next to him, as a father. Daniel blinked, startled. "Dad." Richard cleared his throat, his voice softer than Daniel had ever heard it. "Son, I'm proud of you." The boy's fork froze halfway to his mouth. His eyes widened, his small lips parting in shock. "Really, Dad?" he whispered. Richard nodded, and this time there was no anger, no disappointment, only sincerity. He reached out and pulled his son into a hug, something he hadn't done in far too long. "Really," Richard said firmly. "And from now on, I'll try to be the kind of father who helps you, not just pressures you." For a moment, Daniel sat frozen in his father's arms, almost unable to believe it. But then, slowly, a smile spread across his face. His chest, which had carried the weight of failure for so long, finally felt light. "I won't let you down, Dad," he whispered. Richard tightened his embrace. "You could never let me down, son." From the corner of the room, Clara stood silently, watching the scene unfold. Her eyes glistened with quiet joy. She hadn't just taught Daniel how to solve numbers. She had reminded a father how to love his child. For weeks, she had watched Daniel grow more confident, more joyful. But today was different. Today, she had witnessed something even greater. A bond once broken, now being healed. She smiled softly, her heart full. She didn't need applause or credit. This moment was enough. That day marked the beginning of a new chapter in the Hamilton household. Richard still ran his empire, still held meetings, still commanded boardrooms. But in the evenings, instead of locking himself in his office, he began spending time with Daniel. Sometimes they read together. Sometimes they played chess. And sometimes, to Richard's amazement, Daniel showed him math problems, explaining them with the same excitement Clara had sparked in him. "See, Dad," Daniel would say proudly, pointing to his paper. "This one's like cookies. If you take 3 away, you've got 9 left." Richard would chuckle, shaking his head in disbelief. "You're smarter than I ever gave you credit for, Daniel." The boy's smile in those moments was brighter than any of the chandeliers in their mansion. Weeks later, when another math test arrived, Daniel faced it with calm determination. No panic, no fear. And when he scored an A-, Richard framed the paper and hung it in his office, not because of the grade, but because of what it represented. His son's courage, resilience, and growth. And Clara? She continued her work in the mansion, never seeking praise. But everyone knew, without her, none of this would have been possible. For the first time in years, the Hamilton mansion wasn't filled with anger, pressure, or silence. It was filled with laughter, warmth, and hope. Daniel had found his confidence. Richard had rediscovered his heart. And Clara had given them both a gift more valuable than money, the gift of understanding. And so, in that grand mansion where wealth could buy anything but happiness, a maid had done the impossible. She had healed a father and a son, and reminded them both what truly mattered. And that's how a billionaire son, once called failure, found his confidence, not from tutors or wealth, but from someone who simply believed in him. If this story touched your heart, imagine how many more lives we can change by sharing it. So don't forget to like this video, subscribe for more powerful stories, and share it with someone who needs hope today.